So very warm welcome to all of you on this for this third session where we will be looking at very deeper aspects of the democracy. And as we announced, this is going to be about the organs of the state as to how the state is created or constituted. So let me share the presentation. So in the third session, we will be looking at 1 minute. In the third session, in our 6 weeks long course on constitution and constitutionalism, we are going to look at the organs of the state. Sorry for the typo there. It's session third, and actually we are going to look at how the democracy actually functions and what are the principles underlying the functioning of the democracy. So let me go to a very important statement when we are talking about the different organs of the governance is that republican government is a representative government, and we are going to look at what is the representative government because India is a democratic republic, as our constitution states that India is a democratic republic, and we have to understand the concept of democracy and a republic before we venture into the organs of the states, which I am sure is going to be a very interesting exploration. So a pure democracy is a direct democracy. So whenever we talk about democracy, we are talking about, as we have seen in the previous session, that there are many meanings of the term democracy, and democracy is sort of a keynote of the Constitution of India, and we cannot think about the Constitution of India without without the democracy or the principles of democracy. And when it comes to defining or understanding what's a democracy, a pure democracy is a direct democracy, which means a society consisting of a small number of persons who assemble and administer the government in person. Now, this is what the pure democracy constitute in terms of coming together of a small number of people, and they administer the government in person. But we know that we are dealing with the huge mass of people. Now, in case of India, we are dealing with over 1.5 billion people, and that's a huge number. And they cannot come together and assemble, and they can have a pure form of a democracy. So the democracy that we have seen is in the principles to ensure that nobody is oppressed by another person. And when it comes to a republic, the republic is a representative democracy. And we're going to look into the term representative democracy. And what is the representative democracy? Is a government in which the scheme of the representation takes place. So there is a scheme of representation by virtue of which a republic comes into a being. So India being a democratic republic, we have to understand these concepts at a very deeper level as to what do we mean by the democratic republic. And we have seen in details in the previous sessions as to how the word or the term democracy is understood, and philosophy underlying it, the principles underlying it, that we have seen very deeply in the previous section. So the representative democracy is the delegation of the government. So what is the representative democracy? Is a delegation of the government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. And unlike direct democracy, it is expandable to the greater number of citizens and the greater sphere of the country. So it has no geographical limitations. The representative democracy, which is the republic, has no spatial limitations and is expandable to the greater number of citizens and to the greater number of greater sphere of the country. But it constitutes a small number of citizens. The keyword here is a citizen. Now we're going to look at what is the citizenship all about when it comes to the Constitution of India. And it's a government delegation of the government. The word delegation I'm going to explore more as we move on in the presentation today. The delegation of the government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest, and unlike direct democracy, the pure democracy, it is expandable to the greater number of citizens and the greater sphere of the country. I think this this definition underlies a very, very deep sort of concept here. So, as Baba Ambedkar has given many definitions, one of his very important definition in this context is to understand democracy as the representation of opinions and representation of the persons. Now, here persons doesn't only mean the individuals, but the social groups as well. So, in democracy, the social groups must be able to represent their own self-interest. Now, this will make us understand the very key concept as to what constitute a democratic republic. The all the representation of the opinions and the representation of the persons, as Baba Ambedkar has remarked, and in democracy the social groups must be able to represent their own self-interest. Now, what is it to be a democracy? So it's about to have the rights, liberties, and opportunities. It's not just about the elections. It is not just about voting. It's a very deep concept. So what is it to be a democracy? To be fully democratic, a state would have to provide rights. Without providing the rights, a state cannot be. Here, state means the political entity. Like India is a state in this context. We're not talking about the Indian states here. It's a state means the political entity called called India, that is Bharat. So to be fully democratic, a state would have to provide rights, liberties, and opportunities for effective participation. It's a very key concept. To be a fully democratic, a state would have to provide rights, liberties, and opportunities for effective participation, voting equality, that is also often called the political equality, the ability to acquire sufficient understanding of policies and their consequences, and the means by which the citizen body could maintain adequate control of the agenda of government policies and decisions. To be fully democratic, a state would have to ensure that all, or at any rate most, permanent adult resident, that is the citizens under its jurisdictions, would possess the rights of citizenship. Very important that the right of citizenship is so fundamental to the fully functioning democracy. So democracy doesn't mean only the institutions of the governance, but it also necessarily means a system of rights, liberties, and opportunities. And as Baba Ambedkar says, he brings in very important definition aspect of democracy, which concerns here today, is self-government and democracy become real, not when a constitution based on adult suffrage comes into existence, but when the governing class loses its power to capture the power to govern. In other words, the constitution seeks the democratization of the society, more power to the people, as it were. So what are the rights, liberties, and opportunities? So, political equality is important to ensure the human equality. So what is the political equality entails? It's right to vote in the election of officials in free and fair elections. This is very important. If in a democracy, if there is no right to vote, then this democracy is a flawed democracy. Right to run for elective office. All the citizens have a right to run for elective office. They have the right to free expression. They can express their opinions. Right to form and participate in independent political organizations. They can participate in the political activities. At the same time, they can form the independent political organizations. Right to have access to independent sources of information. That means independent media, which will inform the citizens the truth, not just one-sided picture of the things, as we have seen in the previous sessions, that the opposition party is very important, or the multiple parties are very important in order to have many sources of information so that citizens are informed. And last but not the least, it's very important to have rights to other freedoms and opportunities that may be necessary for the effective operation of the political institutions of large-scale democracy. So, if we have to have a republic, democratic republic, we have to have all these conditions in place. Then only a large-scale political institution of democracy can survive. These are the preconditions. And we will see that how they are put into the Constitution of India. As I'm talking in the previous two sessions, we are not much concerned about the individual articles. We can easily fit in the individual articles here in the scheme of the presentation. But I'm not going to do that because that will become a little bit cumbersome. But all these principles underlying here are we can find in the Constitution of India in the various sections. But this is about the principles behind the organ of state, and I'm going to move to that. So let's look at the key aspect of the presentation today: the constitution, democracy, and delegation. So we have to understand what are the delegated power. As I said in the previous sessions, we studied principles of democracy, federalism, and separation of power. These are fundamental principles of the constitutional system. As we have been seeing, studying, the ultimate power in democracy lies with the people. This is the most important thing. And the ultimate power is with the people. The people delegate their power to a government body or official by a governing entity, typically through the constitution. So, when the constitution itself begin with we the people, the ultimate source of power is the people. And they delegate the power to the officials or the bodies by governing entity, typically through the constitution. So it's a constitution that delegates the power of the people to the government bodies. And in a democracy, power originates from the people. Delegated powers are granted by the electorate, either directly through elections or indirectly through a constitution. So the real power, in the democracy lies in the hands of people, and the people delegate their power to the governing government bodies like the executive, legislature, and judiciary. And they take place this delegation of the power either directly through the elections, through the election of Lok Sabha, or indirectly through a constitution, like the independent judiciary. And delegated powers are specified in the constitution. The Constitution of India actually provides specifies the delegated powers of the various governing bodies. And in the democracy, delegated powers are distributed among the organs of the government to prevent the concentration of power and promote checks and balance. So the delegated powers are not delegated to just one agency. They are delegated, spread across, distributed among the several organs of the government. They are not just in the hands of one entity. Why we do this? Because to prevent the concentration of power and promote checks and balances. Checks and balances, which means separation of power, are the key principles of the constitution or constitutionalism. And delegated powers must be exercised within the framework of the constitution, because the powers are delegated by the constitution. The executive body or the legislature assemblies or the judiciary, they are created by the constitution. The constitution has delegated the power to them, and therefore they have to act within the framework of the constitution. They cannot work extra constitutional. They have to follow the constitution. They have to be exercised within the framework of the constitution. So the ultimate source or the police and the guardian of the constitution and democracy are the people. We cannot say that only these bodies are responsible for that. They are the delegated powers by us. The people have delegated their power to these organs. They have to work for the people. So we the people are the ultimate guardians and the police of the constitution and democracy. So the core constitutional concepts that we see underlying our discussion today are the separation of powers, checks and balances, overlapping power of government, because sometimes the government entities, the state, the executive and legislative, they have the overlapping power, but at the same time they are separate. They have their separate forms. They have their separate purpose. They have their separate working, but sometimes they overlap. And it's actually the core concept of the constitutional concept is the government by the people, we the people. So organs of the states, as we were talking about, how the power is distributed in a democracy. There is the legislature to express the voice of the people. Please bear this concepts in mind. In democracy, there is please do not request anything. In a democracy, there is the legislature to express the voice of the people. There is the executive, which is subordinate to the legislature and bound to obey the legislature. And I'm going to show you, what does the legislature do, or what is the function of executive. Over and above the legislature and executive, there is a judiciary to control both and keep them both within the prescribed bounds, that is within the constitution. You see, if you look at these three organs of the state, of the democracy, the legislature, which expresses the voice of the people, the executive, which is subordinate to the legislature and bound to obey the legislature, and over and above the legislature and executive, there is the judiciary to control both and keep them both within prescribed bounds. That means, within the constitution, within the constitutional framework. If they exceed the constitutional framework, the judiciary has to intervene. Now, so on checks and balances, so I got some very interesting principles from Baba Sahib Ambedkar as to how the checks and balances are maintained, how to safeguard the fundamental principles. Because as I said, that there are certain fundamental principles which are inviolable. They cannot be violated by the legislature, by the judiciary, or by the executive. They are, fundamental principles. And to safeguard those fundamental principles like democracy, like the separation of power, like federalism, which I'm going to look at in the next session, you know, how the checks and balances are built. And that's what Baba Sahib Ambedkar, I am quoting Baba Sahib Ambedkar here, the purpose of the constitution is not merely to create the organs of the state. That's what Baba Sahib Ambedkar says. The constitution not only creates the organs of the state, but to limit their authority. Because if no limitation was imposed upon the authority of the organs, there will be complete tyranny and complete operation. Isn't it? So it is not that the legislature is free to do anything or everything. They are not free to do it. You know, they have to act within the limit. The constitution also specifies the limit to their authorities, right? What is the limit of the legislative assembly? What is the limit of the executive? What is the limit of the judiciary? Because if we do not impose the limitations on them, what will happen? There will be complete tyranny and complete operation. So how important is to preserve this system of checks and balances? And in one remarkable debate, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, whoever captures power will not be free to do what he likes. And he has spoken in the context of the directive principles of the state policy. No government can take away our fundamental rights. That's what the constitution says. And whoever captures the power will not be free to do what he likes with the directive principles of the state policy. Writ, these are very important features of the fundamental rights, and they were the part of the criminal laws and the civil proceedings, the writs, the 5 writs. And when they were made, they were put into constitutional text. Baba Sahib Ambedkar put them in the constitutional text. And I'm going to talk about them in the upcoming sessions. But the writs are, Baba Sahib says, now recognized by a constitutional text, and they could not be taken away by any legislature merely because it happens to have a majority. So even the majority government cannot do away with the writs, isn't it? The principles of writ have actually led to the democracy. As I told you that the value of the individual is an axiomatic, and that's the self-evident truth. It's inalienable truth. And if the government takes our liberty, they have to tell us why they have taken our liberty. In other words, why they have arrested our body, which is called it began with the English law. It is called the habeas corpus. Why my body is arrested? We can ask the question to the government, why I am arrested, why my body is restricted. And that is called the writ of habeas corpus. And it's so fundamental to the democracy that Baba Sahib Ambedkar has put that writ in the constitutional text. And Baba Sahib says that they could not be taken away by any legislature merely because it happens to have a majority. No government is authorized to deal with or do away with the fundamental principles. That's what Baba Sahib Ambedkar is saying. And he says, for myself, in the other context, that's what Baba Sahib Ambedkar says, for myself, I cannot altogether omit the possibility of a legislature backed by party men making laws which may abrogate or violate what we regard as certain fundamental principles affecting the life and liberty of an individual. So the life and liberty of an individual is the fundamental principle of the Constitution. It's a fundamental principle. No government can take it away. No government can do away with the safeguards that have been provided by the Constitution. And that's what Baba Sahib says, talking about the legislature and the government. He says, At the same time, I do not see how 5 or 6 gentlemen sitting in the federal or Supreme Court examining laws made by the legislature and by dint of their own individual conscience or their bias or their prejudices be trusted to determine which law is good and which law is bad. That's a very difficult situation. The legislature cannot do away with the fundamental principles. They are not authorized to, take away the fundamental right for life to life and to have a liberty of an individual. And at the same time, the federal court or the Supreme Court, they cannot examine the laws in a way, how they will decide which law is good or which law is bad. If the judges, for example, are having their own individual conscience and have their own biases and prejudices, how will they be able to mete out the justice? So it's rather a case where a man has to sell between Charbadis and Skyla, and I therefore would not send this is a catch-22 situation even for Baba Saheb Ambedkar. That's why we have this beautiful constitution which clears everything. Nowhere in the history of the world such thing has happened, to have such a constitution which clears everything, which makes everything clear, so that the democracy can function properly. But we know that how the constitution is undermined, how the organs of the democracy, the government, are undermined. So that's what Baba Ambedkar says. So as I discussed in the last session, the constitution as institutional and policy making framework, and this delegation and distribution of power is essential aspect of democracy. So what constitute the organs of the state? A set of formalized bodies like legislature, executive, and judiciary. Each has a distinct structure and character and carries out a particular kind of work. The legislature cannot do the judicial work, the judiciary cannot do the legislative work, or executive cannot do the legislative work, and so on and so forth. So a set of formalized bodies, each has a distinct structure and character and carries out a particular kind of work. The constitutional system is made up of these interlocking institutions and is given shape by their form. So they are interlocking institutions and they are given shape by their form. And the parliament makes laws. As we know that the parliament makes laws, frames and authorizes government action. So the parliament authorizes the government to act. Government is an executive headed by the prime minister, authorized by the parliament, you know, to to set in motion the government action. It makes laws that channel public power and allocate public resources. So this is the important function of the parliament. By the way, the word parliament comes from the French word parler. To parler means to discuss, to talk. So parliament is all about discussion, all about debates, all about talking, coming to the consensus. And consensus is very important. And Baba Ambedkar was very particular about authoritarianism, majoritarianism, and he was totally for the consensus. And he was well ahead of his time in thinking about democracy as to how consensus can be developed. So you see, so the parliament, when the parliament makes laws, they talk about what the government action will be in the future, and the executive means action. Execution literally means action, and it's a present. The government is doing a day-to-day business depending on the laws passed by the parliament, and the judiciary comes into play to access if the law and the action taken is based on the constitution. In other words, test of constitutionality, that whatever the legislature or the executives are doing, whether that falls within the constitution, or it's going against the constitution, or it's beyond the constitution. So it reviews, in other words, assesses the action and the authority of the parliament. So these are, just to put this parliament is futuristic. They determine the future course. Executive works day-to-day basis, like the ministries in Delhi, or the ministries at the state level, and the judiciary comes into play to assess whether it's within the constitution or not constitutional. So I thought I will put this slide up to talk about the history of parliament and the electorate India. And as Baba Ambedkar said, as early as early in his career, he says the unreformed parliament is not a blessing to anyone. So parliamentary reforms are very critical, and that's the point Baba Ambedkar has been making since the beginning of his political public career. He's saying that the parliament has to be reformed. There has to be larger representation. And I'm going to show some of the very beautiful principles and insights of Baba Ambedkar. So let's begin with the history of parliament and electorate in India. Beginning of legislative councils in India by the Indian Council Act of 1861. It established legislative council in each province, and Indians were included. So Indians were included in the councils as early as 1861, and a separate electorate for the Muslims were granted in 1909. And more Indians were included by the Act of 1909, and establishment of the central and expanded provincial council in government of India 1919 Act, limited franchise suffrage based on property ownership and education. That time there was no universal adult franchise. Not everybody has the right to vote. The right to vote was given to those based on their property and education. So only the so-called upper caste in India have the say in the electorate. Isn't that aspect of the Indian history we have to understand? That not all the people have the power to vote, right to vote. Only a particular class of people could vote, and that's how they became politically strong. So significant steps towards establishment of democratic framework in India in the Government of India Act 1935. As we know, Baba Ambedkar participated in the roundtable conferences, which led to the Constitution of the Government of India Act 1935, which is also called the Mini Constitution of India. And it provided for the first time a federal structure with bicameral legislature at the central level. So for the first time, it was established in 1935 that there will be two chambers in the union government, the Federal Assembly and the Council of State, and the provincial legislature. So it expanded the electorate. More people could vote, and the act allowed 15% of the adult population to vote. The 15% of the adults in India could vote in 1935. In the election that took place in 1937, only the 15% of the citizens who were adults could vote. So it was a very limited electorate. It was a limited franchise. It was not extended to everybody. And we know Baba Ambedkar founded a political party, Independent Labour Party, to contest this election. And in 1937 election, in the Bombay presidency, his party won 11 seats out of 13 reserve seats. So 1935 Government of Act, the first elections in India, gave in the larger electoral context, gave representation, reserve seats to the scheduled caste instead of the separate electorate. And we have seen the history of the separate electorate in the past session. So only 13 out of the 13 reserve seats, 11 seats were won by the ILP, and 3 members were elected in the general seats out of 4 contested by the ILP in the Bombay presidency. In the central province and Berar, that's the present in Nagpur area, only 3 out of the 20 reserve seats for the scheduled caste. So even then, because of the lack of resources, the movement didn't have that resource to fight all the elections. So you see, I'm talking about only these 2 provinces. They were the Madras province, there was United province, present UP, there was Punjab, there were so many 11 British provinces at the time, and princely states, of course, didn't have the elections, but they could be represented in the Council of States. So what the Constitution of India created is very important. It created the electorate, included all the adults as citizens to vote, houses and houses of the people, House of the People, and the Council of State, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. So what the Constitution gave, it gave the right to vote to every citizen who were above 18. Now, who were about 21 that time, now it's reduced to 18. It's called a universal adult franchise, and inclusive democracy through reserve seats for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and the greatest safeguard for purity of election, as Baba Ambedkar says, for fairness in election was to take away the matter from the hands of executive authority, that means government, and to hand it over to some independent authority. And Constitution created an independent election commission of India. These are the achievements, and some remarkable achievements which were done there that time in the 50s. Representation of the People Act, which led to the first general elections in 1951, 1952. And there was a need for systematic and fair preparation of the electoral roll. We know how difficult it was, because only the 15% were forming the electorate before that. Now to include 85%, that's the larger mass of the population of India. It's not easy exercise, and that has to be done. And the way it was done itself are very historical. It said that the electoral roll, if you unroll it, it will be miles and miles. So many. And today, when our population is this large, you can imagine how much will be the electoral roll. And that time door to door surveys were conducted, people were verified, and there was the public awareness. And that's how the first general elections were held in 1951-52, and the first Lok Sabha was inaugurated. So I thought, to bring some important points to you as to, why reservation for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes is very important for the democratic institutes. And we know that, there is only reservation in the Lok Sabha. There is no reservation in the judiciary. There is no reservation, quote unquote, in the executive. That is, in the ministries, in the ministerial body, there is no reservation. And Baba Ambedkar thought that there should be, it should be composed of the various, the council of ministers should be composed of the proportionate or proper representation to the various communities. It didn't happen. So let's look at the majority and minority representation in the parliament. So that's what Baba Ambedkar has said. The principles. There is no doubt that the representatives of the higher orders are occupied with the pettiest cares and are more frequently concerned with the affairs of their own class than with the affairs of the nation. These are all true even today. Just pay attention to it. Their life is too busy or too prosperous, and the individuals too much self-contained and self-satisfied for the conception of the social progress to be more than a passing thought of a rare moment. But the lower orders are constantly reminded of their adversity, which can be got over only by social change. See, every single word is so prophetic and speaks of the society of India that time. It speaks of the society of today. And that's what Baba Ambedkar says. This is very, very deep. Baba Ambedkar is a very deep thinker. He says the consciousness of mutual dependence resulting from the necessities of a combined action makes for generosity, while the sense of untrained powers and of undeveloped faculties gives them aspiration. It is to the lower classes that we must look for the motive power for progress. You see, the progress can be only had by the lower classes, because they have the appetite for change. The upper classes or the upper caste, they are too much stable. They are too much fossilized, I would say. There is no movement there. There is no energy there. They are just occupied with their own affairs, own class. They have nothing to do with the affairs of the nation. Otherwise this country would have been different. And the reservation of the seats to the backward Hindu communities makes available for the national service such powerful social forces, in the absence of which any parliamentary government may be deemed to be poorer. How important it is to have the representation of the backward classes. How it's important it is to have the representation from the 85% of the India's population. They are the engine of growth. They are the engines of the social change. And as Baba Ambedkar says in one of the remarks that he makes, and it's very prophetic, because that time the Brahmins had the higher concentration of in the electoral process. They could vote en masse, and this is the solution that Baba Ambedkar had given at the time. Of course, it's not useful today, but that time it was very useful. He said the backward classes should instead benefit from a low-pitched franchise, because there were conditions to be a part, to be, to have the right to vote. Baba Ambedkar said if that standard was lowered for the backward classes, so that more number of them will be able to vote, and that's thus they will change the power structure in favor of the backward classes. He says by making the franchise for the non-Brahmin even lower than the franchise for the Brahmin, the Marathas would improve their position on the voters list, and altogether favored position of the Brahmin would be equalized. Because the electorate itself favored the Brahmins at time. So these are the principles of representation. This is what Baba Ambedkar says. Majority rule is untenable in theory and unjustifiable in practice. A majority community may be considered a relative majority of representation, but it can never claim an absolute majority. This is a very key concept that Baba Ambedkar goes into depth. And the relative majority of representation given to a majority community in the legislature should not be so large so as to enable the majority to establish its rule with the help of the smallest minorities. The distribution of the seats should be so made that a combination of the majority and one of the major minorities should not give the combined such a majority as to make them impervious to the interest of the other minorities. You see, this is how great a thinker Baba Ambedkar was. He is a philosopher, prophet of democracy. How do you ensure that everybody has their rights? This is how you should, work on the principles. The weightage taken from the majority should be distributed among the minorities in the inverse proportion. So more backward you are, the more power you should be given. Isn't it? So that you have an assembly which works on the consensus. It doesn't work on the majoritarianism. This rigid majoritarianism is not going to help. There has to be the consensus, ideas from all the masses of the people. That's what makes the democracy. And, which has a better social, educational, economic standing gets a lesser amount of weightage than a minority whose numbers are less and whose educational, economic, and social position inferior to that of the others. This is what Baba Ambedkar would favor: consensual politics, joint electorate. And these are, just joint electorate or a separate electorate is a matter of machinery for achieving a given purpose. It is not a matter of principle. The principle is to ensure that the minority has a say in the governance. And how we ensure that? Through a joint electorate or a separate electorate. It's a matter of machinery. It's not the matter of the principle. The purpose is to enable a minority to select candidates to the legislature who will be real and not nominal representative of the minorities, which is what is happening today. Stooges and the spoons are created. While the separate electorate gives an absolute guarantee to the minority, because if we have the separate electorate, that the members of the same social groups will elect the representative, that is, representatives will be no others except those who enjoy its confidence. A system of joint electorate which will give equal protection to the minority should not be overlooked. A four-member constitution. These are the solutions that he gave in order to have different minorities' voice in the legislative assembly, parliament, parley, as I say, to speak. And with the right to the minorities to have a double vote and in requiring a minimum percentage of minority votes may be considered as a possible substitute. But this is one of his prophetic statements. The political majorities and minorities are fluid bodies. The political majority changes in different countries, different agendas and the different majorities. But in the case of India, the case of the Hindu and untouchable was different because they were not fluid body. They are like watertight compartments, isn't it? And the purpose of the democracy is to make every community a very fluid body, social osmosis, so that they can participate in the common cycle of participation, which I'm going to show you what Baba Ambedkar thought about. The very important principles that we have to bear in mind. So reservation is a very common. India is not a country, which is very specific. There is a reservation in Colombia, in Croatia, in India, Jordan, Nigeria, New Zealand, Pakistan, Palestine, so on and so forth. So what does this representation do, which in other words we say communal electorate? What it can do in the context of the last slide, it can enable a new cycle of participation in which the representative of the various castes who were erstwhile isolated and therefore antisocial will be thrown into an associated life. This is what the representation does. Imagine what's happening in the parliament. There are members from the scheduled caste. They have to represent the interest of the community. Even if they open their mouth to participate in the debate, that's a huge thing. So there are actually two forms of democratic government, like presidential form of democracy, where the president is the highest, source of power. USA is the presidential form of democracy. India is a parliamentary form of democracy, where the prime minister is a prime among equals. The cabinet is responsible to the parliament. So every execution of a law is, has to be accountable to the parliament. There is a parliamentary accountability in our democracy. And in USA, the president is elected differently by a different electorate, and the Congress is elected by a different electorate. So the sometimes the president is not responsible to the Congress. It has a veto power. President has a veto power over the Congress. In India, such is not the case. The prime minister cannot overrule the laws of the parliament. It's not possible. So in the parliamentary system, what happens? The parliament is supreme and the government is accountable to the parliament. The prime minister is elected in the parliament by the party having majority in the House of the People. The parliamentary system in India constitute the President of India, the House of the People, Lok Sabha, and the Council of State. So we are talking about the legislative body here. And there is a principle of bicameralism. There are two houses. Why these two houses are needed? There is a mutuality of legislative powers between the two houses. There is a principle of federalism because the members of the Rajya Sabha are elected by the states. So the states have a say in the national policy making, though they are just 250 members and 12 are nominated. But still, it's very important to have in a federal structure a voice for the states. And that's what the Rajya Sabha does. Rajya Sabha does much more than merely representing the states. It does more. It's at par with Lok Sabha when it comes to lawmaking, except the money bills. And the Constitution of India places citizens at the center, offers single citizenship. The states have an influence through the Council of States and elected members from the states in Lok Sabha. So I just wanted to talk about how important it is to have the bicameral house. It also maintains the checks and balance within. I'm going to show you, the Rajya Sabha is a permanent body, while the Lok Sabha is not. So the House of the Parliament, House of the People, Lok Sabha, of course, we know election by the popular votes, and the system is called the first past the post. So in a constituency, if there are 10 people and the votes are distributed among them, if the person who gets maximum votes, they get elected. It doesn't matter whether they get the majority vote. And that's the problem with the first past the post system. Sometimes even if you get 20% of the vote and other people, the rest of the 80% votes are distributed among 100 candidates, you are a winner. It's a winner takes all. So there is nothing for the other people. And that's one of the drawbacks of the first past the post system. And in the mature democracies, that drawback is removed. There is a proportion representation. In all the advanced democracies, except in America, there is a proportion representation. And I think we need to talk more about it. And in the House of the People, there is a direct election. And there is, of course, representations for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And it dissolves every 5 years. And, the checks and balance are maintained on the executive government through the question hours debate in the houses and parliament. That's what the House of the People does. Lok Sabha does. It has the checks and balance on the government, the executives, through the question hours, debates in the houses, and various parliamentary committees. Sometimes there are joint parliamentary committees. And the Council of State, it's indirect elections by the proportional representation by a single transferable vote. It's a very key concept. What is the single transferable vote? How it is different from the direct voting. And in the single transferable vote, you mark the ranks. Like, this is my first preference, this is my second preference, this is my third preference. And, there is a limit allotted. If somebody gets that number of votes, they are elected. So in the first round, if the person doesn't get that number of votes, then the last candidate is discarded, and then his preferences, the second preference, given like that, and the process is repeated till the point where the candidate gets the number of votes that are required. This is what is done in the presidential election in India as well. So in the Council of State, there are indirect elections by proportional representation by single transferable vote. Electorate is made up of the members of the legislative assemblies of the state. So every state has got the numbers allotted to them depending on their population, and the members of the legislative assemblies of the state elect. Such is not case with the United States, which is totally undemocratic, because in the Senate, even if you are a small state, you have the two representative. Even if you are a large state, you have the two representatives. In the Senate, there are 2 seats allocated to every state. So the small states have hampered so many of the civil rights laws, like the laws for the freedom of the blacks. They were stalled in the Senate of America because of this system, undemocratic system in the Senate. And the Council of State is a permanent house. It never dissolves. 1/3 members retired every 2 years, and their tenure is fixed for 6 years. The Council of States represent the interest of the states in the federal structure. The Council of the States also provides checks and balances on the House of the People. I'm not going to go into that because you can all study that. The underlying principles are important. And the president, of course, is the head of the state, ceremonial head of the state. It's sometimes they call it rubber stamp, but he has the power to give oath. So it's like the head of the state, and the prime minister is the head of the government. And representation in the organs of the governance and electorate, this is very important. And we know that the first past the post and the proportional representation. Now in the mature democracies, there is a proportional representation, more satisfying democracy. All the social groups are represented in the advanced democracies, and it has gone ahead from the majoritarian majority to the consensual processes, and that can only happen in the proportional representation. It cannot happen in the first past the post, the system that we have today in India. In the in the Lok Sabha, there is a relative majority, winner takes it all, as I told you. And the proportional, there are various elections in India, the proportional representation in the Rajya Sabha election and nominated members. And in the case of presidential election, there is also the proportional, there is a there's single transferable vote. And there has been, there is a very beautiful system which is evolved. And in the presidential elections, the vote is transferred. And the absolute majority, if he gets vote 50% of the vote, the person is considered to be elected as a president. So I taken it from the UN report, which I have put also in the group. The election as instruments of democracy, and different countries have the different electoral systems. Like we have what they term as the plurality or majority system. There are mixed system. There are proportional representation. Other forms of electoral system. We follow the first post the poll, and that's where India falls. And I just wanted to bring to you that in the mature democracies, in 72 countries, there is a proportional representation, and in 91 countries, a plurality or majority. And this is what it shows. So the first past the post electoral system has certain disadvantage, like it exclude minorities, excludes women, many vested votes, often need for by-elections, requires boundary delimitation, may lead to gerrymandering, difficult to arrange absentee voting. For the mature democracies, the form which is suggested is the proportional representation. And it's very effective. And there are empirical studies which shows that the proportional representation system, electoral system, is more effective than the first past the post. So let's not go into the debate. Let's go to what is executive. So what in India executives consist of? I just told you before that there are two forms of democracy: presidential form, as in USA, and the prime minister, parliamentary form, that's India. In India, the executive is headed by the prime minister, and of course, he has to work with his cabinet ministers. Even that, that is very important. And prime minister is prime among equals, but he's very powerful. If he resigns, the whole cabinet resigns, and the whole cabinet, if the individual minister resigns, it doesn't do much damage. But if the prime minister resigns, the whole cabinet resigns. It's empirical. And the cabinet is accountable to the parliament and accountable to the people. Parliamentary checks and balances on executives through question hours, as I said, debates, reports, and parliamentary committees. And all the decisions are taken in the name of the President of India, because he is the head of the state. And it's very, very important for the democracy like India, which was just coming into being that time, to have the independent civil services is secured constitutionally, all India services. So they are all very interesting sort of features. As Baba Ambedkar said, that he will go into the comparative studies of the Indian constitution and other constitutions, and that's in itself a very interesting study. If we can study the Indian constitution or constitutional system with that of the British don't have the written constitution; they have unwritten laws. With the American system, with Australian, and there are, you can find that anywhere as to how our constitution is comparable to different constitutions of the world. So I thought, let's not include that here. It will, in the 1 hour you cannot do much, but that's itself an interesting study to see how independent the civil services is in United States. There are the party in the power, it has got certain seats. They can allocate the bureaucracy to their well-wishers. So, but in India, there is an independent civil service which is secured constitutionally. Now, this bilateral entry is, of course, the negation of that independent civil services, because the partisan parties can elect their own, people. And let's look at the third organ, that is judiciary. It's the guardian of the constitution, and it has got a very important function to test the constitutionality, whether the acts made by the parliament are constitutional. And it is an independent judiciary, and it's very, very interesting. It can offer the review. Now there is a debate, judicial review and judicial activism. We will not go into that, but the judiciary has no power to make laws and no power to legislate. And the most important, Baba Ambedkar says, when he's talking about the panchayat courts, that there has to be representation. And he says that the Supreme Court, is prostituting, and in other words, the judiciary has to be made representative. If there are competent members from the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, OBCs, women, minorities, they have to be included in the judiciary. Judiciary cannot just be represented by a particular class of people. Now, we've seen what happens when the judiciary or any organ of the government is represented by the community which is very settled, you know. And this representation is very important to safeguard the constitutional values. Very important. So, just we are nearing to the end of our presentation. Are organs of the state represented in India? That is the question. And are they democratic? So I will leave you with these open questions, and I'm going to bring something up to date. I cannot do much in these small sessions, but let's look at some of the key points. Like, since the first Lok Sabha 1951-52, no political party to date has secured more than 50% of the popular vote. Not happened in India ever. That even when the Congress was dominating, it was the largest party with a lot of resources. It never went beyond the 50% of the population, popular vote. Never. And they had the majority, sometimes absolute majority, sometimes super majority. But they never exceeded, the Congress party and now the BJP, they never exceeded more than 50% of the popular votes. That is something. That's something that we have to bear in mind. And in India, there was a one-party dominance, though even they never got more than 50% of the vote. But the one-party system dominated. Congress was dominant over the decades after the constitution came into play. And then we saw then there was an emergency. The democracy was thwarted by Indira Gandhi in 1975, 72, 77. And then we see there was a change in the government. The Janata Party came, and then again the Congress Party came with the 48% of the popular votes, but never more than 50% though, never. And the rise of regional parties and other ideologically oriented parties like the BSP, that's all. And the backward class politics, of course, saw in the rays of hopes. And that's what ultimately democracy does. It hands over power to people. Though the BSP never got the percentage share of masses it represented, the highest popular votes that the BSP got was 6%. Isn't it? Even if say it's represented the backward classes like 85% of the India's population, it still couldn't go beyond 6%. They had MPs and MLAs. The BSP was in power 4 times in the UP. But that's we are talking about the state governments. But if you look at the national percent of the BSP, it never exceeded. It was just hovering over 6% in its heydays. Now we have seen in the last previous three elections like 2014 and 2019, it was an era of coalition, but the two BJP governments had absolute majorities on their own. And we have seen what happens then. And now in the 2024, we have a coalition government with limited mandate for the BJP. Now the larger question, as we said, that the democracy must work for the welfare of the people. It has to work for the people, by the people, of the people. So the question is our constitutional democracy working towards welfare of the people? Which means all these three organs of the government are the responsible to the people. That's the larger question. I will leave it to you, and I will end my presentation here. Let's open it up for any discussion, any comments from you.
Hi, Jai Bhim.
Jai
I'm
Pritam.
Pritam.
Yes, Pritam.
So thanks for your really amazing and wonderful presentation. I really love it. So my
Thank you.
question is that what do you think about collegium system and how it aligns with our constitutional principle?
See, collegium system, there are a lot of questionable things which are happening, right? So what's your opinion on that? Let's begin with that.
I think it doesn't align with our constitution,
Hmm. Why is that?
and
Why do you think like that?
I think like that because uh, there is no way we can represent through that system,
Hmm.
through like our people in that system.
Right. It's like becoming a club, not open to other people, right?
Yeah, it's
So it's
not
like hereditary.
inclusive.
It's not inclusive. It's like a hereditary system where,
Yeah,
the son of a judge will be nominated by, it's like, very, we will say, nepotistic system now.
yeah, it's not
And yeah,
inclusive at all.
yes, 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 yes. So, what kind of the suggestions we can have, like examination, like UPSC, where the judges, like, at the state level, there are the examinations to become a judge, like that. It's a very deep questions as to how to make judiciary accountable. Pritam, you have raised a very
Yeah,
important question.
we can have examination. I mean, that's much better than the collegium system
Right.
if it's
What
fair.
what other people think about what Pritam said?
Good evening, sir.
Good
Xavier.
evening, Nikhil.
Sir, what I believe is that if we try to more decentralize it like we did in legislature. So basically right now, due to the, you can say, the excuse given is the independence of judiciary. That is why the third Judges Act that happened didn't made the appointment mandatory on the recommendation of Chief Justice and the Collegium. So what I believe is like the in the state level we are having the judicial examination where district judges are being elected. Similar, if that can be extended or maybe they only can be promoted, because uh, right now what is happening is that as a lot of reports are also saying, we there is no accountability, as well as even the verdicts are mostly you can say showing their background as well, not purely on the constitution. They are kind of like upholding the rule of law.
Hmm.
So what I believe is like there should be some kind of intervention. The NJC was done by the legislature, but that also was declared unconstitutional
Right.
based on the independence thing only.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
maybe this UPSC kind of system which promotes you further and further can be seen. Also properly implementing the norms of reservation and everything.
Good, good.
That would be important.
See, it's very beautiful, Nikhil. What I think, one of the limitations of this 1 hour is I cannot do much. And I expect some of you to, like, find articles that, the principles we are talking here are found, the articles that mention these things like independent jury. But what does it mean? Why the judges cannot make laws? Even the law, even they cannot have a say over their salary. It's the parliament that decides their salary. Of course, they have some, these are very fundamental questions. They were debated in the parliament, in the
So there are
constitution.
some security of tenure, like they can't decrease the salary,
Hmm.
as well as there is Article 142 where they can do extrajudicial intervention and make laws, but that is very limited, not
Yes. So
entirely is
yes.
dependent on the
So
parliament.
what I would like to request you and Pritam is to, go through the sessions and back them up with the articles. Is possible? Because I think that would be a good exercise. I would
Yeah,
love to do it, but right now I'm busy. And also offer the comparative studies as to, like America, they call the Supreme Court the super chamber. But even they have a big problem with the judiciary, the 9 judges, they are called, top judges. Even the 5 of them agrees on something, it becomes a law. And it's not like Indian constitution, it defines a lot of things. While there are a lot of open-ended questions there. So I think, comparative study and, finding the articles is a good exercise for all of you if we can do it.
okay, sure.
So anyone else? Anybody? Umesh?
Sir, do we have some indicators to map the democracy, such as poverty, happiness? We have a lot of indicators. In this global world, there should be some indicators that can mark the democracy index,
Yes,
which cover all the.
there are, and, one of them is, gagging the voice of the opposition. And one of them is to resort to the violence. The state itself resort to the violence, and there are many indicators to show. And if we put India to the test of that democracy, we'll find that we are nowhere. We are just
Yeah.
in a sense, we might be having on the surface political equality, but even that is not there, because some of the if we talk about the present questions on the EVM, even if there is a fair little amount of doubt on the part of the citizen, the government should change it. Even if it might be the right system to do the electioneering, but if the people citizens have doubt, it has to be changed, isn't it? So we cannot say with all, there are standards to judge. And if you look at the Indian government today, it fails on all the counts. Yes, Pritam?
There
Yeah,
must
I
be,
have gotten
there must be some
Yeah.
reflections on that. No.
Yeah, there are. I will talk about them, in the maybe in the last last session.
I
uh,
just wanted to like just put what like Dr. Ambedkar also mentioned, that constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. We must realize that people have yet to learn it. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on the Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic.
Very true.
yeah, so I have got an interesting question in my mind, and
Yes,
I
please.
want to ask. So, what is the line between democracy and dictatorship? Like, how do you know if it's dictatorship? And
As I said, like, for example, let's look at what happened in Germany. And Hitler never had a popular majority, though he was elected, but he didn't have the popular majority. But he used that power to coerce certain ideology, which is called Nazism, and same with Mussolini, the fascism. And if you look at India, never any party has got more than 50% of the vote, including the BJP. And the different states are at a very different ideologies. But if you are trying to impose a one particular viewpoint, where you are denying the citizenship right to the people living here in this territory, and if you are trying to sham or damn one particular communities, you are creating polarization. You are not talking about democracy, you are talking about dictatorship. You are tending, if it's not consensual government, if the minorities are not taken into consideration, it's like we are veering towards dictatorship. So there are definite indicators to show when the state has become authoritarian. There are no fundamental rights. All the fundamental rights are denied. As what happened during the emergency. Indira Gandhi, took away all the fundamental rights. There was no fundamental rights, and fundamental rights are basic to the democracy. So you can know it, right, Pritam?
yeah, yeah, as happened recently in South Korea.
Yes. So anybody has anything to say?
I have one question, Mangesh.
Yes, Jayaji.
Jai Bhim, Mangesh ji.
Hmm.
Actually, I'm concerned about that. We see that democracy is being weakening day by day. Gradually, all the pillars of democracy are being weakened, like the media and the judiciary, all are being managed. So I feel that we are being pushed towards the authoritarian government. So, do you feel that we are moving towards the presidential type of democracy?
I cannot say that, but we are definitely going towards a very authoritarian regime. And it's not so just my opinion, but it's the opinion of the international agencies which survey the democracies regularly, that the democracy index in India is now very low. And it's not easy for to, turn a lot of things upside down, because India is a very diverse country. And if we study the constitutional system very deeply, and what Baba Saheb Ambedkar had done, he has actually safeguarded the nation in favor of we the nation. And his genius will be realized when this country will go through authoritarian regime, because it's what he has. Even if there is, you have money, muscle, and everything, even then you cannot do much directly. right? So there is a written constitution which is very difficult to sabotage because the people in India are habituated towards to the elections and talking and all. But there is an unwritten constitution, like the laws of Manu, they are unwritten, and the deep state has entered into the legislature, the judiciary, everywhere. They are same people coming from the same communities. There is no representative democracy. There is no democratic republic, isn't it? There is no representation. So we are in a very tricky situation, as you said, rightly said. And I think the ultimate custodians are the citizens. We have to raise our voice. We have to talk. We have to discuss. We have to debate. That's what makes that we have to try to bring social and economic democracy. At least we have to further the social democracy, so that when the time is ripe, India becomes a very mature real democracy, right?
Mhm. Is it possible that they can amend the constitution
No, no,
to
no.
make
There
it
are
a
there are certain
presidential
features
form?
of the constitution. If you amend, if you change that, you liquidate the country, because India is constituted on those fundamental principles. If you do away with that, you can do it by, you can try to do it by force, but it's very difficult because the people are getting aware, public conscience is increasing, people are talking about democracy, people are discussing. It was never happening in this country before, when only one particular group of people talked about democracy. But now there are discussions at large. Sure, people will be reading them, they will be understanding what the constitution has done, what is the democracy doing, and how it's undermined by a group of people. I think that can happen.
Mhm. Yes, thank you.
Sir, when can we can see the constitutionalism?
Yes.
We have seen a lot of isms,
Yeah.
and that constitutionalism is pending, and the word this is not mentioned anywhere in the constitution, but it is very much required over.
Mm. No, it's actually the choice before the people is whether you have to follow the anarchy, violence, civil disobedience, and lack of progress, or you want to move further. So the only way to move further, as Baba Ambedkar said, that there is a constitutional. So one author, I think Madhav Khosla, said, like the grammar of anarchy, which the word Baba Ambedkar used, the grammar of constitutionalism. So what this country needs. So the sooner the people realize that we don't need the grammar of anarchy, we don't need the grammar of fundamentalism, we don't need the grammar of hero worship, because that's ultimately will lead to lack of democracy. The more lack of democracy, the more country is pushed into the depth of poverty, violence, and so on and so forth. Right. So it's we have to promote the constitutionalism. Those who are aware, those who wants to work on the democracy. Right.
It's a right framework is required to go ahead
Yeah.
in this field. Thank you. Thank you.
So anyone has anything to say?
Acha, I have one small question.
Yes.
Whether this recruitment of judges, whether this was discussed in the Constituent Assembly?
Yes.
What was response of Dr. Ambedkar?
He favored independent judiciary, for sure.
Agreed. But what about selection of judges?
This is a
Anything he
very
said about?
gray area. Even in the Constituent Assembly, they have actually a lot of debate on that. And, because it's a specialist body, but Dr. Baba Ambedkar has always favored that, the elites, even how you're educated they cannot do it. And there is, I'm not so aware about the Constituent Assembly debate, but there is a comment by Baba Ambedkar where it says that the Supreme Court of India prostitutes. And these are very strong words. And that's in the context of the representation. So we know that not everything Baba Ambedkar said was accepted. We are talking about the principles.
My question is whether any recommendation was made about formation of Indian Judicial Service, just like IAS and IPS.
No, there
Whether
was.
such a idea was discussed
I'm
or
not.
not.
I'm not aware of that. I'm not
Okay.
explored into that.
Even I have not read. Hmm.
But the principle remains the same. It has to be representative, right? Yes. Anyone?
Mangesh, actually, I want to ask everybody over here that do everyone think that there should be reservations for the appointment of judges, Supreme Court judges, especially, or and High Court judges as well?
I think this is one of the reasons they are not introducing Indian Judicial Service. Once they initiate this Indian Judicial Service, reservation has to be implemented, which they will never like to have.
Okay. Anyone has anything to say?
Yeah, my last question. So, can judiciary make an verdict based on faith?
No, cannot. It has to work within the constitution.
Yeah, but there was
They make it,
Ra-
they go beyond constitution. It's not every organ has to work within the constitution because they are
but,
created by the constitution.
but there is one contradiction. There was Ram Mandir verdict based on faith. It was not
Yeah,
based on the
we
evidence.
we we know everything, right? We know what is happening.
Yeah.
So let's conclude here today. It has gone long, and thank you so much for joining in. Very wonderful session, and see you next week with very interesting session as to how the federalism works in this country and what are the underlying principles and what we can learn from them. And I think some of you must take responsibility to bring out the articles, maybe share in the groups and comparative studies that will benefit other people a lot. So let's stop here. Thank you and see you next week.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you